In 1994, Jeff Bezos had a pretty good job as a hedge fund manager, and he read that year that the internet grew by 2,300%, 2,300% in just 1 year. And so he started to think of ways that he could kind of take advantage of this rapid growth of this new thing called the internet. And he decided that he was going to quit his job and open this small kind of online startup company selling books. And so in 1994, he started this company called Amazon.com as an online bookstore. And they were such a small company. He started in his garage at the time, and they actually had a little bell that dinged every time that an order was placed. Well, if you know Amazon, you know that it didn't take very long. In fact, within a couple months, that bell was ringing so often they had to turn it off because they weren't able to get any work done because this bell just kept constantly ringing and ringing and ringing. And so since then, the company has gone from this small online bookstore to literally selling anything that you can imagine. You can find almost anything you want on Amazon. And this company has revolutionized the retail industry. And along with that, and several other investments that Jeff Bezos has made, he was able to capture the title of the world's richest man in 2017. And with the exception of about a month earlier this year, he's held that title ever since. And his net worth is about $190 billion. That's right, $190 billion. And so when a man of that kind of wealth gives advice, people tend to listen to him. In fact, he now makes money traveling around telling other people how they can make money. In fact, that's what you just saw was kind of compilation of different speeches that he's given of sharing business advice and sharing how you can make money and how you can do these kind of things for yourself. And so he literally travels the world talking to students, talking to MBA students, talking to even senior vice presidents and presidents of smaller corporations. And he gets thousands of dollars to go around and travel to give business advice to people, partly because he has that title of the world's richest man. And so it's been said that if you want business advice, you go to somebody who's in business. If you want to be rich, you go to someone who's rich because they've been there and they've done that. And so it would only make sense that if we're going to listen to the world's richest man, that we should listen to what Solomon says in Proverbs chapter 6, because as impressive as Jeff Bezos' $190 billion is, it's really chump change compared to how rich Solomon was in his day. You see, if we base on what the Bible tells us that Solomon received every year in taxes and tributes from other places, if we take that amount in gold that he was receiving and kind of adjust it for inflation, then Solomon's net worth would be $2.2 trillion. $2.2 trillion. Now get this, that's 4 times the amount if you took Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, and Warren Buffett. You take those 4 men, combine their net worth, multiply that times 4, and you're still not quite at how rich Solomon was. He was definitely the richest man in the world. So we would be foolish not to listen to business advice that Solomon would give. We'd be foolish not to pay attention to the words of wisdom that he has to offer us. But to be honest with you, these are not just words for business advice. These are not just things that hey, I don't own a business, I'm not a business person, that you write off. Because these are words of wisdom that you can use for not just business, but you can use them kind of for personal finances, and you really just should use them for life in general. And so these aren't necessarily just business advice, it's really life advice from the world's richest man. And so we're going to jump into Proverbs chapter 6. We're going to read through the first 19 verses of that proverb. And so Proverbs chapter 6, chapter 6, verse 19. Let me get to it on my screen here. It starts off by saying this. He says, "My son, if you have put up security for your neighbor or entered into arrangement with a stranger, you have been trapped by the words of your lip, and ensnared by the words of your mouth. Do this then, my son, and free yourself. For you have put yourself in your neighbor's power. Go, humble yourself and plead with your neighbor. Verse 4. Do not let sleep, or do not give sleep to your eyes, or slumber to your eyelids. Escape like the gazelle from a hunter, like a bird from a fowler's trap. And then verse 6, he kind of switches topics a little bit. He says, Go to the ant, you slacker. Observe its ways and become wise. Without leader, administrator, or ruler, it prepares its provisions in summer. It gathers its food during harvest. How long will you stay in bed, you slacker? When will you get up from your sleep? A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the arms to rest, and your poverty will come like a robber, your need like a bandit. In verse 12, he says, A worthless man, a wicked man, goes around speaking dishonestly, winking his eyes, signaling with his feet, and gesturing with his fingers. He always plots evil with perversity in his heart, and he stirs up trouble constantly. Therefore, calamity will strike him suddenly, and he will be shattered instantly, beyond recovery. The Lord hates 6 things. In fact, 7 are detestable to him. Arrogant eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that plots wicked schemes, feet eager to run to evil, a lying witness who gives false testimony, and the one who stirs up trouble among his brothers. Let's pray together. Father, we thank you so much for today. We thank you for who you are and what you do for us. God, we thank you for wisdom that we can gain, both in the business world and wisdom that we can gain in our personal lives and our personal finances as well. God, I pray that we see this text for what it is. God, advice not just for business, but advice that we should live by, advice that we should be guided by, and principles that should guide not just our business life, but our personal life and everything that we are, Father. And so, God, I pray that you speak to us through this text this morning. God, I pray that you open our eyes and open our hearts, God, to maybe places that are uncomfortable for us because it's a place that needs conviction. God, I pray this morning that wherever we're at, God, that you open our hearts to maybe a place that we need correction, that we need to be set right, that we need to hear your words and make a change in our life, Father. God, I pray this morning, God, that we will seek you and we will seek your wisdom, not just for the wealth that it brings, but for the righteousness that we can show, for the glory that we can reflect back to you, Father. So I pray that you speak through this text. I pray that we are students of your word this morning, Father. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. This week I read an article in Forbes magazine, and several years ago this article was put out, and it was started off like this. It said, let's face it, no matter how smart we are or think we are, we're all prone to make mistakes with our money. And the article went on and outlined the 10 most common foolish financial decisions, and that was their word. These are the 10 most common foolish financial decisions that people make. And this was true not just in the business sense, but in the personal finances as well. And according to this article, the number one financial mistake that people make is, get this, I love how they worded it. They said that people spend money that you don't have on things you don't need to impress people you don't like. Let me read that to you again. That people will spend money on things you'll spend money on things that you don't need to impress people that you don't like, and you'll spend money that you don't have on things you don't need to impress people you don't like. Far too often, people in business and people in finances, we're too busy trying to keep up with the Joneses without thinking that if we keep up with the Joneses, that means we got to keep up with the Joneses' debt as well. That far too often we find ourselves saying that we got to do this, we got to impress these people, and we got to impress these people, and whether it's true in business or in our personal life. And what we end up doing is we end up kind of sinking ourselves and plunging ourselves deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. And this debt is not the kind of investment debt. This is not a debt that we're talking about that you're going to invest in something and it's going to pay you back a return at the end. That's not the kind of investments we're talking about. That's not the kind of debt we're talking about. What Forbes magazine is talking about is the kind of debt that is just going to deteriorate. It's the kind of debt that you're not going to receive any return on in your investment whatsoever. This is the debt that really won't matter. It won't benefit you in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. And it is really spending money you don't have on things you don't need to impress people that you don't even like. And you see, by any stretch of the imagination, that is foolish. By any stretch of the imagination, it is foolish to spend money you don't have on things that you don't want just because you're trying to impress somebody that you don't really care about or you don't really like. You see, if we're going to be wise with our money, if we're going to be wise in business, Forbes magazine says if you're going to be wise, the first thing you have to do is you have to avoid foolish debt. And so this is not a new idea. Forbes magazine didn't come up with this idea a couple years ago. In fact, it's the same advice that Solomon gives his son and all of us in the very first part of chapter 6 of this passage, and to avoid this foolish debt. And Solomon opens this chapter, he opens it a little different. In the other chapters, he's kind of opened up with this kind of parental appeal. Son, listen to my words. Pay attention. I'm getting ready to tell you something super important. But in this chapter, he is really kind of laser focused. In this chapter, he really gets down to business, if you'll kind of excuse the business pun that we're going on. He is really focused and let's do business and let's go straight to this. And so he starts off addressing this idea of debt. And he really kind of focuses not just on debt in general, but this foolish idea of taking on someone else's debt. And so he starts in verse 1, and he says in verse 1, he says, my son, if you put up securities for your neighbor or enter into an agreement with a stranger. In today's terms, we would call this co-signing either for a loan that someone has or co-signing for a line of credit that someone has access to. And so Solomon's warning against this. And now most of us know how co-signing works, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, let me kind of give you a rough example of it. Let's say that I had something that I wanted to borrow money for. It could be a business investment, it could be a car, it could be whatever. And I don't have the money to purchase it or to get it myself, so I'm going to go borrow that money from the bank. And so I go to the bank, and they're going to ask me all kinds of financial questions. They're going to ask me what my income is. They're going to ask me if I have any other debts. They're going to ask me what my assets are. Do I have a house? Do I have other cars? Do I have collateral that I can put up to guarantee these things? They're going to ask me, what my credit history is, what my credit score is, or maybe not ask, they're going to find that out through their own research, but they're going to ask all these tons of financial questions, and really the purpose of them asking their questions and seeking all this information document is really to get down to this simple question, is do they think I'm trustworthy enough that I've got a good enough background to pay back what I'm getting ready to borrow? If they're going to give me money, they want kind of assurance that I'm going to be able to pay that back. And so they ask all these questions. They dig into my finances to see if I'm a good risk with their money, because it's honestly their money. They're just loaning it to me. I'm going to pay it back to them. Am I good risk for them? Or are they going to be able to get their money back after the terms of the loan are over? That's why they ask all those questions. And so let's say I go in the bank and I give them all these forms and I submit all these documents to them, and somebody is going to kind of look at all this information and they're going to come up with a decision. And the decision is going to be, yeah, we think you're a good risk. We think that we're going to be able to get our money back from you, that this is a smart decision, and so we're going to give you this money. Or they're going to look at all that and say, you know what, there's just not enough history here. There's not enough or maybe there's too much bad history here. There's just not enough equity for us, that we really think you're really too high of a risk for us to give you this money. And so if that's the case, they're going to say, sorry, no, you can't have the loan. They're not going to give me the money that I'm trying to borrow. Or they may say, yeah, we'll give you this loan if you can find a co-signer. Right? If you'll find somebody who will sign for this loan for you, someone who will kind of guarantee that you'll pay back this loan. And so me wanting to borrow the money would go to my great neighbors that live around me, and some of them right here and some of them there. And I would go to my great neighbors and I would just say, hey, I've got this idea. I've got this loan I'm trying to get. I just need somebody to co-sign me. And since we've been friends, since we've been buddies for so long, do you mind just co-signing? Do you mind signing this loan for me? And of course, my neighbors, because they're so gracious and wonderful and generous people, they're going to, I can hear you guys laughing from across the street. You guys are going to say, sure, absolutely, no problem whatsoever. This isn't going to be a problem. And so you're going to sign for this loan. And what you've done when you sign for that loan is that you have guaranteed that that loan is going to be paid back. And you're going to guarantee, you're going to put up collateral, you're going to put your name on the line that loan is going to get paid back. And so let's say that for whatever reason, I make a couple payments and then I just take the money and I run. All right? I make a couple payments and then I skip town, I take off. Well, in that case, the loan is still got to be paid back. And the bank is going to make sure they get their money back. Except I've flown the coop, I'm out of town, they can't find me. Guess who they're coming after in that time? They're coming after my neighbors who guaranteed, who put up the authorization, the signatures. They're going to come after them because honestly, they're an easier target than I am at the moment because I'm on the run. And so suddenly, my neighbors, all they've worked for, their savings, their cars, even their house, all that stuff is on the line because of a debt that I incurred that they signed for. And so they become this easy target. And all of a sudden, my good, gracious, wonderful neighbors, they get all the burden of the debt without any of the reward. I got the money. I took off with it. But they carry the burden and the stress and the anxiety of that. And so suddenly we start to see, if we look at co-signing in those tense, we start to see why in verse 2 that Solomon says, hey, you shouldn't do this. If you have done this, you have been trapped by the words of your lips and ensnared by the words of your mouth. You see, your good name, your credit, your good reputation, you put it all in the hands of someone else. You put it all in the hands of, honestly, you put your money in the hands of someone else who the bank has already said they're a high risk. That we don't trust them with our money. We don't trust that that they have enough business practicality. We don't trust them enough to pay it back. But if you trust them enough, you can we'll give them our money, but we're going to get your money in return. All right? So this idea they are carrying the burden, and you have really put your financial well-being, your financial success, you put all this in the hands of someone else, and you've given them the power. You've given your neighbor, whoever you put this loan through, you put your money in their hands. And by the way, it's somebody that the bank has already said, we don't really trust that we're going to get our money back. And yet you gave them that power. And so as a co-signer of the loan, you were trapped in the financial and legal entanglement that honestly you have very little control over. You have trapped yourself. And so he says in verse 3 that for this you have put yourself in your neighbor's power, that your neighbor now has control, your neighbor now has the power because you co-signed, you put up your good name, your good reputation on their behalf. And so Solomon gives this warning. The very first warning he gives you is, listen, don't get in this situation in the first place. To avoid this situation at all costs. Don't be trapped and don't be entangled by someone else's financial debt. And don't be entangled by someone else's legal affairs. Stay away from these things. Avoid these things if you can. Right? Don't take on this foolish debt of somebody who somebody else has already said is too risky for their own debt. Avoid this. But then he goes on in verse 3, he says, if you have done this, if you have put up collateral, if you put up security, if you've co-signed for somebody, then do this, my son, and free yourself. How do you free yourself? You go, you humble yourself, and plead with your neighbor. So the advice is this: try any way you can to get out of this arrangement, get out from under this burden that you're feeling, get out from under this financial entanglement that you're at. In fact, don't just try to get out of it. Try to get out of it as quickly as possible and get as far away from it. In fact, verse 4 and verse 5 give us this idea of get out of this thing quickly. It says, don't give sleep to your eyes or slumber to your eyelids. In verse 5, I love this illustration. He says, escape like a gazelle from a hunter, or like a bird from a fowler's trap. I don't know if you pay attention much to animals, but when a gazelle is trying to escape from a hunter, whether it's a person or a predator, he doesn't just walk around. He doesn't just meander around. He doesn't just walk and take his time. Man, he doesn't waste any time. He is gone. He just instinctively runs as fast and as far away as he possibly can. This is just his instinct. And same thing with a bird who gets out of a trap. He doesn't just hop around on the ground, man. He flies. He gets out of there. He gets gone as quickly as he possibly can. And so Solomon's advice is simply this: listen, don't take on someone else's foolish debt. Don't sign for it. Don't entangle yourself in this. But if you have, get out of it as quickly as you possibly can. Get out of it and get as far away from it as you possibly can. Because you're always going to find that it brings more trouble on you than it's worth. It's always going to be more trouble and more headache and more stress for you without any of the reward of the loan or the investment on your behalf. So avoid this foolish debt. That's the first piece of advice that the world's richest man is going to give us. The second piece of advice that the world's richest man is going to pass on to his son is simple. Don't be lazy. That's it. That's how simple it is. Just don't be lazy. You see, success and prosperity only come through a solid and a hard internal work ethic. And poverty, what he's going to say is that poverty is often the result of procrastination and passivity. And we're going to see this because he gives this great example in this passage in verses 6 through 11. I love this example. He gives this example of an ant. And he says in verse 6, he starts off in verse 6, he says, "Go to the ant, you slacker. Observe its ways and become wise." And I honestly love this translation because it uses the word slacker, mainly because that's a word, honestly, that I would use. I kind of chuckle every time I read this passage, and it's a word that I would use. A different translation would say, "You lazy person," or "You sluggard," but I love the word slacker because it really, like I said, it's a word I would use, and two, it's a word that really gives a good picture of what he's trying to portray. Someone who is slacking, someone who's not doing anything. And so, believe it or not, Solomon is the only person in the whole Bible that uses this term. And he uses it in the book of Proverbs 15 different times. This is the first. There's another one in the same chapter. And then he doesn't use it again for a while. But this idea of a slacker. Most of us probably have an idea of what that looks like in our head. Most of us don't raise hands, don't nudge anybody. But most of us, at least when we hear that term, we can probably think of somebody who fits that picture in our mind. And so he tells the slacker, he says, go to the ant. And honestly, you got to think about the humility that this takes. Go to the ant, observe its ways and become wise. Think about the humility that he's passing on, because what he's doing is the richest man in the world. He's talking to his son. He is the king and his son is the prince. His son is the heir. His son is going to inherit this mass fortune. And he tells his son, who's all this clout, all this authority, all this stuff, you need to go pay attention to the ant. You need to observe and watch the ant. If you want to be smart, then get down on your knees, stoop down, slow down, and pay attention to this tiny little minute animal that most people don't even pay attention to. Most people don't even realize these ants are there. You need to go observe them. You need to go pay attention to them. You need to go watch them and observe them and be wise. And honestly, I think for many of us, we miss so many great life lessons because we're either too proud or we're too busy to observe something small that's in front of us. You see, I think that we so often should kind of have this attitude that we don't know it all, even though we may be surrounded by a ton of stuff and things like that. I think sometimes we miss some of life's great lessons because we won't stoop down or we won't slow down long enough to observe the lessons that are right there in front of us. And so if we took that time to slow down and to stoop down, man, we'd be so much wiser than we are right now. And so if you ever take the time to slow down or stoop down and look at an ant, man, these guys are impressive. They don't ever stop. They just move constantly, and they work, and they're moving all the time. They're either carrying food or they're looking for food. If they're not doing that, then they're digging holes. And if they're not digging holes, they're moving the larvae and the eggs around. If they're not doing that, they're cleaning, they're feeding the young. Man, these guys, they're always working. They're always doing something. And so that's the lesson that Solomon wants his son to learn from an ant. Man, always be on the move. Always be doing something. Don't be lazy. And he uses this ant as an illustration, because if we're going to overcome laziness, two things have to happen. The first thing that has to happen, and he points it out in verse 7, the first thing that's got to happen is we have to have a strong internal work ethic. It's got to come from inside and not from outside. You see, this is the reason he points to the ant in verse 7. He says that without a leader, an administrator, or a ruler. You see, the ant doesn't have a boss man that follows him around. The ant doesn't have a boss man who's breathing down his neck. He doesn't have a supervisor that's giving him constant instructions or directions of go do this, now do this, now do this. He doesn't have an administrator that's following up. He doesn't have a manager that's following up with all the numbers at the end of the day saying, did you meet your quota? Did you bring in the right amount? Did we do this? He doesn't have somebody kind of watching over his back all the time and making sure that everything is like it's supposed to be. He doesn't have somebody directing him and giving him directions constantly, but he doesn't need that because he has this strong internal work ethic, this desire on the inside to go out and do what he's supposed to do, to go out and to do the best job at the best of his ability. And he has this internal motivation to go out and to do what needs to be done. And he honestly has this internal motivation for two reasons. One, because he wants to eat. That's what's best for him, all right? So he's going to go out and he's going to search and search and search for food, not because somebody makes him, but because he wants to. And he's going to do that because A, he wants to eat, but he's also going to do it B, because he knows that's what's best for his colony, for his society, for his culture, for his family, if you will. And so his motivation doesn't come from the outside, it comes from the inside. And so listen, this is the lesson that many of us need to pay attention and learn from the ant, that if you want to better yourself, if you want a better business model, if you want a better job or a better paycheck or a better position, then you need to be motivated from the inside and not from the outside. You need to have an internal desire to do what's better and to do better work and to try harder. And it's got to come from the inside. You see so often, too many people, they slack off and they only do their best work when the boss man is around. And Solomon's advice is, listen, don't do your best work just because the boss man's there. Do your best work all the time. You see, so many people will do their best work when something big is happening and their name's going to be on it, or the year's coming to an end and they know evaluations are getting ready to happen. So let's really shine in this moment. Let's give our best. Let's show them our best. And Solomon's advice is, listen, don't give your best just because your evaluation is getting ready to come up. Give your best because on the inside, you know that's what the right thing to do. Give your best. Always do your best. Always be giving your best, whatever it is. And for us as Christians, the reason we are motivated from the inside is because we know that whatever job we have, whatever position we have, we know that whatever job we have, it is a gift from God to us. It's a blessing for us. And to give anything less than our best, to quote Steve Freefontaine, the Olympic runner, to give anything less than our best is to sacrifice that gift that God has given us. And to sacrifice what the blessings that He's given us. So any job that we have, any position, regardless of what it is, it's a blessing and it's a gift from God. And shame on us for not giving it our best. Shame on us for sacrificing and for degrading God's blessing for us. You see, this is the exact same thing that Paul talks about when he talks to the Colossians. In Colossians chapter 3, verse 23 and verse 24. In verse 23, he says, whatever you do it enthusiastically. Do it literally from the soul, from within the depths of you, as something done for the Lord and not for me. And in verse 24, he goes on to say, knowing that you'll receive the reward of an inheritance from the Lord. You serve the Lord Christ. You see, our work ethic shouldn't be determined by our boss man, our paycheck, or even our position. Our determination, our work ethic should be determined solely by the God who made us, the Christ who saved us, and the Holy Spirit that lives within us, because that is who we serve, that is who we work for, and that is who gave us the blessings and the abilities to work. So don't just do your best because somebody's watching over your back. Do your best because God has given you this blessing, and don't wasted. You see, there's something else that he says that's got to happen if we're going to overcome laziness. If we're going to overcome laziness, we got to shift from this mindset of procrastination to this mindset of being proactive and taking the initiative and seeing the opportunities that are right in front of us. And again, he points to the ant. And again, in verse 8, he's telling this whole story about the ant. And he says that the ant prepares its provision in summer and it gathers food during harvest. You see, summer and harvest for the ant, that's when food is plentiful. There are leaves to eat, there are fruits, there are berries, there are other ants and insects that are out there that they can eat off of. Man, during the summer and during the harvest, there is food everywhere. And what he says about the ant is that the ant is proactive. He's going to go out there, and if there's food to eat, he's going to go get it when it's plentiful, because he knows there's coming a time that the food is not going to be as plentiful. He knows there's coming a time when it's not going to be as readily available. It's going to cost him more. He's going to have to work harder for it. If he doesn't go out and get it now, it's going to be harder to get it in the end. So even without a calendar, an ant knows when the food's there, you go get it. An ant is proactive, and the food's there, you go after it. And you see, that's the lesson that Solomon wants his son to pick up on. That's the lesson that the world's wisest and richest man wants us to pick up on. If the opportunity is there, take it while it's there. Don't waste it. Don't push it off. Don't be a procrastinator. Don't be like the slacker that he mentions, because the slacker is all about procrastinating, pushing it off to a later time. You see, in the slacker, while the ant's out working, the slacker is sleeping. In verse 9 and verse 10, he tells him that the slacker is sleeping the day away. He sleeps, he slumbers, he sits around with his arms folded around, all while there's work to be done. You see, the picture of the slacker is somebody who, yeah, there's work, but I got time to do it later. Yeah, it's there, but it's going to be there tomorrow. Yeah, it's there, and I probably could do it, but I got plenty of time to do that. I'm not worried about that. There's plenty of time to take care of it. I'll get to it sometime. You see, the slacker procrastinates while the ant is proactive. One of them is out working and taking advantage of every opportunity that's in front of him, and the other is sitting at home sleeping because, we'll do it some other time. You see, I'm convinced that we miss so many opportunities and so many advantages because we put stuff off later instead of doing it when it could be done, instead of doing it when the opportunity is right square in our face, when the opportunity is right in front of us, when we have the greatest opportunity, we push it off to the side. You see, and it's not only true in business, but it's true in a lot of different areas of our lives. It's true of students when we do our studies. It's true of when we have opportunities to witness and to share about Christ. I know that person. I'll see him again. I'll do it later. It's true of the way we spend our time with our spouse or with our kids. Yeah, we could do it now, but I'd rather do this. And I got plenty of time. I got plenty of years to spend with them. And they're kids now, but they're going to be kids for the next 18 years, and I'll just shove that off till later. You see, we waste so many opportunities that are right in front of our face. We waste so many opportunities because we'll get to it later. And see, there are a lot of folks that are going to say, well, I really do my best work at the last minute. I really do my best work when I'm under pressure. And that may be true. You may do good work when you're under pressure, but I'm going to highly doubt that you do your best work at the last minute. And the reason I'm going to doubt that is because I somewhat had that same mindset and somewhat have to guard myself against that same mindset sometimes, because I was guilty of that, turning in the paper at the last minute or preparing that presentation at the last minute. And when you do that, I don't know many people that do that don't either find a mistake in that paper or they find after that presentation, oh yeah, man, I meant to include this, or I should have said it this way instead of that way. You see, in doing that, you didn't do your best work. You did good work. I'm not going to say you didn't do good work. I'm just going to say you didn't do your best work, because if you'd have prepared and been proactive, then you'd probably found those few little mistakes. You probably put that extra statistic in there. You probably put those extra numbers or made sure those numbers were right in the first place. And so very few of us, in fact, I would say none of us, are going to do our best work at the last minute. We may do good work. We may do great work, but I highly doubt that we ever do our best work at those last minutes because we're putting it off. We're procrastinating until the end. So the advice that Solomon gives is, man, be proactive. Be like the ant. Take full advantage of every opportunity that you have, and take every advantage of every opportunity you have. And you can't do that if you're procrastinating, if you're pushing things off. So go ahead and get to the business and get to it, and don't be lazy. You see, we have to have this internal motivation, and we have to be proactive. And otherwise, like Solomon points out, skipping down to verse 11, he says, otherwise, if you are lazy and if you're not like the ant, he says, your poverty will come like a robber, and your need like a bandit. You see, procrastination will rob you of your future. The anxiety and the stress of waiting to the last minute will steal away the joy and the pleasures that you can be experiencing right now, or the joy and pleasure you can experience in the future if you were proactive like the ant. So he says, first, don't take on foolish debts. Second, don't be lazy. And then he gives this third piece of advice from the richest man in the world. He says, always, always be open and honest. And this is true, not again just in the business world, but in every aspect of our life. And like the other examples that he gives us, he gives an example of this one advice as well. Except instead of using animals, he turns this one to a person. And he uses a person for this one. And he describes him in verse 12 as a wicked person or a worthless man, right? And so he says in verse 12, in that verse, he says, a worthless person, a wicked man, who goes around speaking dishonestly. In the Hebrew, the word for that is that he speaks or he talks with a crooked mouth, right? It kind of gives you a visual picture when you say it that way. Somebody with a crooked mouth, someone who kind of talks out of the side of their mouth and to be honest with you, I tried to practice that last night, and I couldn't really give it to you. I couldn't really do it, and so it's a good thing nobody was around to see me practice, because it was kind of humorous to even think about it. But I was trying to just kind of give you this visual picture of someone who talks out of the side of their mouth, and so a crooked mouth. Kind of think of someone who talks to the side. All right, so they're going to look at you, and they're going to say things to you, but really they're not talking to you. What they're really doing is talking around you or about you. They're talking about you and the situation, but they're not talking to you. They're talking to people around you or beside you. And so their conversation looks like it's directed at you, but it's really directed off to the side. You get the idea that their body language is not matching the words that are coming out of their mouth. In fact, he goes on to describe a little more of their body language in verse 13. This wicked and worthless man, he winks his eye, he signals with his feet, and he gestures with his fingers. So when I was a kid, I used to play baseball, and as I read this passage, it really just reminds me of the third base coach, that he was giving signals to the runner on second, or he was giving signals to the batter, and he's using all these. He's touching his nose, and he's pulling his ear, and he's pulling his cap, and he's doing all these hand signals, all these gestures that doesn't really mean anything to anybody else, because what he's doing is he's speaking in code to the other people, to the players that he wants to pay attention to. And that's exactly, I'm picking on baseball a little bit, but that's exactly what Solomon is describing here. Someone who may tell you, hey, get ready to run, but at the same time he's giving you a signal, no, don't, stay put. He may be saying, yeah, stay put, but meanwhile he's giving you a secret signal to take off and to steal that base. What he's doing is he says one thing with his mouth, but he uses his body language to tell you to speak in code for something else. You see, he's not open, he's not honest, and he's not telling you the true deal. And in fact, if he's going to do a business deal, he's going to do a business deal with one of those little wink winks and a little nudge on the side. This is what this is going to work like. This is how this is going to be. And so there's always some kind of hidden meaning. There's always some kind of hidden agenda. There's always some kind of shady deal going on behind the scenes with this guy. He's never open. He's never honest. He's never straightforward about anything. And so he is worthless because his word is worthless. His word is one thing, but his body says something else. He is wicked because of what he says in verse 14, because he doesn't have any honest dealings. And he's wicked in verse 14 because he plots evil with perversity in his heart, and he stirs up trouble constantly. And so he says, listen, don't be deceived by this guy, and don't be deceived by the smooth talking of this guy, because eventually all that stuff is going to catch up with him. In verse 15, he makes it clear that all the trouble that he stirs up, it's going to come back to bite him, and the crooked mouth is going to come back to him. He says in verse 15, therefore, calamity will strike him suddenly. He will be shattered instantly, beyond recovery. This guy is dishonest, and he's going to dig himself a hole that he can't get himself out of. And this isn't just bad luck. This isn't karma and nature coming back to get him. This is divine judgment that God's describing here through Solomon. This is God judging him. And this judgment for not being open and honest, it is swift. It shatters in an instant. It's going to come on him when he least expected. When he thinks everything's perfect and fine, that's when judgment will hit. And judgment's not only swift, but man, it's catastrophic. It will shatter his world beyond recovery. When he deals with this divine judgment, there's not going to be a remedy for it. He's not going to be able to talk his way out of it. He's not going to be able to deal his way out of it, to strike a bargain. And there's no way out of this judgment. He's not going to be able to plead for a lighter sentence or something like that. He is stuck in this judgment because he's constantly using his words for deceit. He's constantly using his language in a dishonest way. And as I read over this passage, I began to think over all the times that this Proverbs come true, and we've seen these Proverbs come true time and time again. I began to think of all these wealthy businessmen and women who went from a huge life of luxury to prison sentence. I began to think of like the Bernie Madoffs and the Enron CEOs and even the Martha Stewarts. These people who had it all together, man, they had it made, multi-millionaires. Everything was going their way and everything was perfect. And then calamity struck because of their crooked mouth, because they're winking the eye and pointing with their finger, or gesturing with their fingers and signaling with their feet. All of a sudden, these people who had it all made, what happened to them? Judgment happened, and they went from the penthouse apartments and the luxury suites to the jailhouse and the jail cell and the jumpsuits. Man, their life changed drastically, and they will never recover from that. They will never be back in those positions they once were again. And so Solomon's advice is, listen, if you want to avoid their demise, then avoid their behavior. Always be open and honest. Always mean what you say and say what you mean. Don't be shady in your dealings, and avoid this calamity that awaits those who talk with a crooked mouth. Always be open and always be honest. You see, that's one of the ways that we're going to follow this last piece of advice. And that's that you can circumvent the chaos. You can avoid the chaos that happens in business and in your life. You see, he ends up in chapter 6, by listing several things. And this is the first list that he gives us in the book of Proverbs. And he's going to list out several things here. And several times in the book, he's going to give us a list. In this section, he's going to list the things that God hates. These are things that the Lord hates. It's not a completely inclusive list, meaning this isn't all that God hates, but these things he hates. Okay, and hate is a strong word. But when he does this, he does it in an interesting way. When he gives us a list or he introduces us a list, he does it in kind of an unusual way. Let me show you what I'm talking about in verse 16. He says, the Lord hates 6 things. In fact, 7 are detestable to him. And so this is a common formula. We're going to see this a couple other times in the book of Proverbs. And what he's doing is he's saying that there's 6 and then there's this 7th thing. And he's going to do it with different numbers. Like there's going to be 4 and then there's a 5th thing, or there's going to be 3 and here's a 4th thing. And what he's doing is he's going to typically list the smaller number. So in this case, he's going to list the 6th. And then he's going to list the 7th. And the 7th is somewhat the result of those 6 that are listed above it. All right. So the last one he lists in this list of 6 or 7 is because that is the result. That's the end product of what happens when you see these other 6 things. And it could just be one of the 6 things. It could be all 6 of those things. And so he jumps in verse 17, and he starts with this list of things that the Lord hates. And he lists them out in verse 17. He lists 3 of them in verse 17. He says the Lord hates arrogant eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood. And he goes on in verse 18 to add 2 more. A heart that plots wicked schemes, and feet eager to run to evil. All right? And then he adds the 6th one at the start of verse 19. A lying witness who gives false testimony. So that's the 6th thing. And you're reading verse 19, you're saying, well, he's already talked about a lying tongue, so isn't this a little repetitive? And it is, but it isn't, because in this case, he's using very specific language. In this case, he's addressing someone who is a lying witness, not just someone who's lying. This has the legal context to it. This has the legal ramifications to it, that this is someone in verse 19 that is called into a legal situation as a witness. And so this person is called in, and he's addressing a lying witness, meaning that they are someone who is called in, and they're going to say they saw something they didn't see, or they're going to do the reverse. They're going to say they did see something that they didn't see. All right? And so some way they're looking to prevent or pervert justice for someone else. Okay? So he's not just addressing the lies that are coming out of their mouth. He's really kind of addressing in verse 19 this idea that someone is trying to prevent justice from taking place, or someone who is perverting justice either for their own gain or for someone else. And so this is kind of this internal attack on the justice system that's been established for the public's protection. That's what he's addressing in verse 19 versus just the line in verse 17. There's a deeper meaning here. And so the result of those 6 things we have in verse 19, the very end of it, the result of those 6 things is one who stirs up trouble among the brothers. You see, this is someone who brings chaos into the community. This is someone who brings anarchy into the association. This is someone who brings fear into the fellowship. And this is someone who brings disorder to the organization. And you end up with this really toxic environment that is really counterproductive to whatever it is you're trying to do, whether you're building a business or whether you're trying to better society. Having these characteristics are going to stir up all this trouble. They're going to be trouble for you. And so the business advice here is this. In this list, if this is the list of the things that the Lord hates, then we as Christians, we as followers of God, we should hate these things as well. And so we should honestly look over this list, these 6 things, and we should honestly plead with God, God, is there anything on this list that applies to me? Is there anything on this list that fits me? You see, meaning that we should hate these things too, that we shouldn't have arrogant eyes. We should never be described as having lying lips, that we should never be so impulsive that we can't control our anger, that we are quick to shed innocent blood. That's what he means by that. That we should never be plotting wicked schemes, which means we think the rules apply to everybody, but they only apply to us when it's convenient for us. That's plotting a wicked scheme, that you're only going to use the rules when they're good for you and only to your advantage, not apply them to everybody all the time. They apply to them, but they only apply to you when you can use them for your advantage. That is plotting a wicked scheme. And we should never try to prevent or pervert justice in any way, shape, or form for ourselves or even for someone else. You see, but as much as these are characteristics that shouldn't be with us, they should also not be with people that we are associated and doing business with. So here's the business practicality of this. If you're looking for a business partner, and you're looking for someone you could partner in with business, or if you're in a position where you're looking to hire someone, or you're looking to add an employee or add someone else to your staff, then what he's telling you is pay attention to these things. Don't enter into an agreement, don't partner with somebody, don't hire somebody that any one of these is a characteristic of this person. You see, if you do this, if these fit you or fit anyone you're working with, then what you're doing is you're inviting chaos into your community. You're bringing disorder into your organization. And so what you're really doing is you're sabotaging your own success. If you look over this list and any of those could be applied to you in any way, shape, or form, you are the reason that your organization is not working. If you're looking to hire someone, pay attention to this list, because if you bring someone on who fits this list, then you have sabotaged the success of not only you, but your organization as well. And so the advice is clear. Circumvent or avoid this chaos. Avoid the anarchy that comes with these traits. Don't be part of them by any stretch means of the imagination, but don't be in business and don't hire someone who these are part of their characteristics. These are things to look out for if you're looking to add an employee or looking to partner with somebody. And this is the advice that Solomon will give you. Circumvent this chaos before you ever get into it. Avoid these things that God hates. And so if you're looking not just for business advice, but life advice from the richest man in the world, these are what he would tell you. Avoid foolish debt. To always learn from the ant and don't be lazy. That if you're going to better yourself, do it by being open and honest. Because if not, calamity is going to come your way. And finally, circumvent the chaos by avoiding and not doing the things that the Lord hates. See, that's how we build a business. That's how we build on what we're called to do. That's how we better not just ourselves, but our society as well. We follow the advice of the world's richest man who gave us the wisdom from God himself. Let's pray together.